Last week in our reading from the book of the prophet Isaiah, we encountered what is called the suffering servant. And that is that figure that's in the 52nd through the 55th chapter of Isaiah, this figure that was sent by God to come to earth and to accomplish God's will on earth. And we saw that the servant is a man of great courage, a man of conviction, a man of single-minded determination to complete his mission. And the servant trusts God alone. And he's ready and willing to endure any hardship, any suffering, in order to remain true to his mission, to his purpose, to his identity as the servant. Maybe you know people like this. You know, people who are single-minded about a goal that they have for themselves, and they will go through anything to get it. You know, like how athletes are. And maybe you know somebody who's like that with their faith. Maybe it's you. That, you know, their faith is the thing that guides them, and they stay on that path, and no matter what comes, they keep faith, and they try to do the will of God. At any rate, last week, the servant spoke about himself in the first person, and he kind of is introducing himself. He introduces his mission and his identity. And from the very early days of the church, this reading about the suffering servant has been seen as a prophecy of Christ. And Christ fulfilled this prophecy in his life, suffering, and death. In today's first reading from the book of Wisdom has also been interpreted as a prediction of Christ's suffering and death. And while we don't hear the word servant or about the suffering servant specifically in today's reading, we can imagine by listening to it maybe what the servant's persecutors might have been talking about. They might have been talking about him in this passage. And we see in today's reading from Wisdom that the people despise this person. They envy him because of his just way of living, his seeking to do the right. He's obnoxious to them. You know, obnoxious. Blech. They can't stand this guy because, you know, he just by his words and his actions, he points out to them their sinfulness. He points out to them their pettiness, their littleness, their meanness. And they want to kill him. And not only do they want to kill him, they want to put him to a shameful death. They're full of envy, they're full of rage and violence, and they want to vent that on that just man. Think about times when you are angry, when we are angry. We're angry with someone, and maybe that anger was based on some very real and very painful offense that someone committed against us. You know, there are times when we're kind of justified in our anger. But there are other times when our anger is based not so much on something that someone did directly to us, but some offense against our pride, against our sense of well-being. You know, somebody might just be going along being themselves, doing what they do, but something they do picks at something in us, and it gets us, you know, full of anger, full of rage, and sometimes we can't get that out of our heads. And maybe that person's actions pointed out some weakness in us, some flaw in us that we don't want to look at. Maybe another person's actions might have stood in our way of getting what we want in life. You know, they might have just like crossed our paths in the wrong way. Sometimes our anger and our hurt feelings are less about what someone has done directly to us and more about our sense of self. Our sense of, you know, having that sense of pride in ourselves rattled just by another person's presence, just by their actions. And we get locked into anger. Maybe we have some envy going on. Maybe we have a resentment that we can't get rid of. In our second reading today from the book of James, from the letter of James, James gets right to the root of what causes us so much stress, so much grief, and so much anger in this life. And what James sees as the problem is our selfishness, our self-centered desires, our passions, our grasping, our wanting, I want to get this. For James, the problem is our egoism. Egoism, I-ism, me-ism. It's all about me. And I get angry when I am offended. And it all comes down to this human flaw that goes back to Adam and Eve. It's the craving for power. It's a craving for comfort and success and wealth. And I'm not just talking about financial wealth. I'm talking about what that desire to collect, collect people, collect experiences, collect power, collect, love, collect whatever. I want to be filled up. I want it all. And sometimes when we have these desires, these passions within us, they cause us to fight for what we want. And I don't mean that in a good way. Like it's good to fight for a good cause. I mean, we're going to fight and we're going to grasp and we're going to get what we want, no matter if we hurt others or if we sin against God. So James gives us today the diagnosis of our problem when we're, consumed with anger and envy. And our Lord Jesus Christ gives us the solution. Jesus, throughout Mark's gospel, keeps trying to get his disciples to understand that he is not some worldly power. He's not a magic man. He does miracles, he heals, he raises the dead, but he's not just some magic guy that goes around poof, making things happen. And he's not a power seeker. Jesus was not in it for his own personal gain. Jesus is the suffering servant. He's the one who is willing to suffer for the sake of the right and just cause, and he will suffer, he will die, rather than sin, rather than fail to do God's will. And when he says this about himself, the implication is that if I'm a disciple, then I can probably expect the same thing. The disciples don't get it, though. And so they sit around and they argue about, power and prestige and who's the greatest, who's the first, who's the best out of us. And that's the illness, that grabbing on to greatness. And Jesus gives us the cure. And the cure is, if we want to be great, we must become the servant of all. We must receive even a little child in Jesus' name. And now that might not seem so great to us now because we love our children. They're adorable and they're wonderful and they're so full of promise and hope. But in Jesus' culture, children were not, cuddly little people that we love to watch. They were property. They were non-persons. They had no rights. A father could do just about anything. Not so much in Jewish culture, but in Roman culture, if a father had trouble with his kids, he could expose them, which means just throw them out of the house. A little kid, So when Jesus says this, when he says, receive the child in my name, he doesn't just mean give him a little hug or a pat on the head or, something like that. He means that we should give honor and value to that which is without honor and without value. Jesus is basically turning the world upside down in his preaching. And especially in this is a complete reversal of expectations and of values, and a non-person is made the greatest person. And then he tells us that only by taking on the identity of a servant, of a child, can we enter into a relationship with Christ. And only in relationship with Christ can we have a true and lasting union with God. In our own lives, if we want to experience real happiness, real greatness, real fulfillment, real peace, we have to give up. We have to let go of our passions. We have to let go of our obsessive desires. We have to let go of that striving for more. We have to give up, the Beatles had a song, I, me, mine. We have to give up I, me, and mine. Jesus tells us we have to become like little children before God, completely dependent on God, completely open and completely vulnerable and completely trusting of God. We have to become servants. We have to put the needs and the plans and the authority that we want for ourselves at the feet of another. And that other is God. In the end, what Jesus calls us to is to follow him to the cross. We follow the suffering servant of God to the cross, and there we lose our earthly life. But in losing that, in giving up, we attain eternal glory. That's what our faith is all about. It's about going to the cross, turning our lives and our wills over to God, trusting that God will take us and glorify us like he does the little child and bring us to eternal glory.